We think we know the medieval world. We see castles, knights, and kings. We think of it as a brutal, simple time, a dark age. But that's a cartoon. The Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years. That's twice as long as the time between the Roman Empire and today. It was a complex, messy, and surprisingly innovative period. Leadership then wasn't about wearing a crown and pointing a sword. It was about survival. It was about navigating a world with no instant communication, no reliable data, and where a single bad decision could get you and everyone you cared about killed. The leaders of that time faced challenges we can barely imagine. They ruled without spreadsheets, without email, without any of the tools we see as essential. Yet they built institutions that still stand. They managed complex networks of loyalty. They made decisions that shaped the world we live in. So what can they teach us? What have we forgotten in our rush for efficiency and data-driven management? The lessons are not about battle tactics or royal succession. They are about the raw human core of what it means to lead. They are about persuasion, resilience, and the weight of a legacy. What if the most useful leadership advice isn't in a modern business book, but in the dusty chronicles of a forgotten age? Number 17, what does it mean to fail? We talk a lot about failure today. We say it's okay to fail. Fail fast, fail forward. We treat it like a learning opportunity, a stepping stone. It's a sanitized concept discussed in comfortable offices over coffee. In the medieval world, failure wasn't a learning experience. It was the end. It was final. The consequences were not a bad quarterly report or a dip in stock price. The consequences were a head on a spike. When a medieval leader failed, they lost everything. King Edward II of England is a brutal example. He ruled from 1307 to 1327. He lost key battles against the Scots, particularly the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. He alienated his powerful nobles. He favored cronies over competent advisors. His failure wasn't just political, it was personal and absolute. His own wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, led a rebellion against him. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and then, according to most chronicles, murdered in a horrific way at Berkeley Castle. His failure cost him his crown, his freedom, and his life. There was no pivoting from that. This absolute nature of failure shaped every decision. The stakes were always ultimate. This created a kind of ruthless pragmatism that we have lost. Leaders had to be brutally honest with themselves about their capabilities and their limitations. They could not afford the luxury of ego-driven projects that had a low chance of success. Wishful thinking was a death sentence. When William the Conqueror prepared to invade England in 1066, he knew that failure meant the destruction of his army and likely his own death. He waited for months for the right wind, gathered intelligence, and secured promises of support. He did everything possible to stack the deck in his favor because he only had one chance. This contrasts sharply with modern corporate culture, where sometimes the penalty for a billion-dollar failure is a golden parachute and a new consulting gig. Research from the University of California's Haas School of Business often explores the principal-agent problem, where executives, the agents, can take huge risks with other people's money, the principals, because they are insulated from the true consequences of failure. A medieval king was the ultimate principal and agent combined. The company's failure was his failure. The kingdom's ruin was his ruin. He couldn't sell his shares and walk away. The lesson here isn't to bring back execution for failed projects. It's to reintroduce a sense of genuine consequence. It's about understanding that leadership decisions have real-world impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. The medieval leader felt this in their bones. The loss of a battle meant the death of men who had sworn an oath to you, men you had eaten with, and whose families you knew. The failure of a harvest meant your people starved. The weight of that responsibility is something we've professionalized away. We talk about headcount reductions and restructuring, using language that distances us from the human cost. For a medieval lord, the cost was standing right in front of them, in their great hall. So, what if we led as if failure had real personal consequences? Not death, but something meaningful. What if a leader's bonus was tied not just to profit, but to the well-being and stability of their workforce? What if we stripped away the corporate jargon and faced the raw, human impact of our choices? The medieval world teaches us that leadership without accountability is a dangerous game. Failure should feel real. It should hurt, Because that's what makes you careful. That's what makes you wise. What do we not know? We do not know how many leaders were paralyzed by this fear of failure. History is written by the victors, the ones who took the risks and won. How many potential dukes or kings chose quiet inaction over a risky gamble and were simply forgotten? How did the constant looming threat of annihilation affect their mental health and their ability to think creatively? And in our modern world, have we made failure so comfortable that we are no longer incentivized to do the hard, careful work required to truly succeed? Number 16, are you just a manager or a practitioner? In our world, it's common for a person to lead a company in an industry they have no hands-on experience in. A CEO might move from a soft drink company to a tech firm. They are professional managers. Their skill is seen as transferable. It's about spreadsheets, supply chains, and shareholder value. The actual thing the company makes is secondary. This would have been an absurd idea to a medieval leader. A medieval king was not just a manager of a kingdom, he was its chief practitioner. A king was expected to be the best warrior. He was supposed to lead from the front. Richard the Lionheart, King of England from 1189 to 1199, built his entire legend on this. He was a brilliant military strategist and a fearsome fighter. His reputation wasn't based on his administrative skills, which were actually quite poor. It was based on the fact that he was in the dirt and blood with his men during the Third Crusade. His followers knew he could do what he was asking them to do. He wasn't directing the battle from a tent far behind the lines. He was in the thick of it. This created a bond of trust and respect that no management seminar could ever replicate. This applied to more than just warfare. A lord was expected to be an expert in land management, and they needed to understand crop rotation, animal husbandry, and the economics of a manor. How could they judge the performance of their reeves and bailiffs if they didn't understand the work themselves? A king was also the chief judge. He would personally hear cases and dispense justice. The concept of the king's justice was a powerful tool of state building. People believed they could appeal directly to the ultimate authority, a person who understood their problems. Louis IX of France, who reigned from 1226 to 1270, was famous for this. He would famously hold court under an oak tree at Vincennes, listening to the petitions of any of his subjects, rich or poor. He was not just managing a justice system, he was performing justice. Like, this idea of the leader as a practitioner builds a specific kind of credibility. It's the difference between a boss who says we need to increase sales and a boss who can actually go out and close a difficult deal themselves. In a 2012 study published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by economists Edward Lazier, Catherine Shaw, and Christopher Stanton, it was found that supervisors who were themselves highly productive workers tended to increase the productivity of their teams. The researchers suggested that the best bosses are often experts in the field they manage. They can teach, mentor, and accurately evaluate the work of their subordinates because they've done it themselves. The medieval lesson is about the danger of abstraction. When a leader becomes too removed from the actual work of their organization, they start making decisions based on models and reports, not on reality. They lose touch with the people doing the work and the customers they serve. They manage the map, not the territory. A medieval lord walking his fields knew the territory. He could see the health of the crops, talk to the peasants, and understand the challenges on a visceral level. He wasn't reading a report about crop yields. He was smelling the soil. So how can we apply this? It means leaders need to spend less time in boardrooms and more time on the shop floor, whatever that may be. A software CEO should know how to code, or at least understand the architecture of their product deeply. A hospital administrator should spend time shadowing doctors and nurses. A retail executive should work a shift on the cash register. It's not about micromanaging, it's about maintaining a deep, practical understanding of the core work of the organization. It's about earning the right to lead through competence, not just through title. What are the big unknowns? Did this focus on practical skills sometimes blind medieval leaders to larger, more strategic issues? Could a king so focused on being a great warrior, like Richard I, neglect the less glamorous but essential work of statecraft and administration? At what point does an organization become too complex for a single leader to be a practitioner in all its facets? And have we overcorrected so far that our modern leaders lack the fundamental credibility that comes from truly understanding the work they command? Number 15, who controls your story? Today we call it public relations or branding. We have entire departments dedicated to crafting the corporate narrative. In the medieval period, they didn't have press releases or social media managers, but they understood the power of a story better than we do. A leader's survival and success depended heavily on the narrative that was told about them, and they were masters at shaping it. This wasn't just about boasting, it was a sophisticated, multi-pronged effort. One of the most powerful tools was the chronicle. Kings and powerful nobles would patronize monasteries and scribes to write the history of their reigns. These were not objective accounts, they were carefully constructed narratives designed to legitimize their rule, celebrate their victories, and vilify their enemies. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, was initiated under King Alfred the Great in the late 9th century. It presented a heroic story of Wessex and Alfred's fight against the Vikings, unifying his people and creating a shared identity. It was, in effect, a brilliant piece of content marketing for the House of Wessex. Another tool was visual storytelling. Heraldry, the system of coats of arms, was a visual language that communicated identity, lineage, and allegiance at a glance on a chaotic battlefield. The architecture of a castle wasn't just for defense, it was a statement of power, permanence, and wealth designed to awe and intimidate. The construction of great cathedrals, often funded by monarchs, was another way to tell a story. It was a narrative of piety, devotion, and divine favor. When Suger, the abbot of Saint Denis, rebuilt his church in the early 12th century in the New Gothic style, he was telling a story about the French monarchy's connection to God, using light and space as his language. The epic poems and songs were the viral media of the day. The Chanson de Roland, an epic poem from the 11th century, tells a heroic, though historically inaccurate, story about one of Charlemagne's knights. It was sung by troubadours and minstrels in courts and taverns across Europe. You know, it wasn't just entertainment. It was a story that defined the ideal of the Christian knight, glorified Charlemagne's reign long after his death, and served as a powerful recruiting tool for the Crusades. A leader who was the subject of a popular song had a kind of fame and influence that was priceless. The modern connection is obvious. Leaders and organizations are constantly trying to control their narrative. But the medieval approach was different. It was less about spin and more about myth-making. You know, they were trying to embed themselves into the very fabric of their culture's story. They understood that stories are more powerful than facts. A good story creates an emotional connection. It provides meaning. As cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner argued, we are 22 times more likely to remember a fact if it has been wrapped in a story. Medieval leaders knew this intuitively. The lesson is to think beyond the mission statement and the quarterly report. What is the epic story of your organization? What are the myths and legends? Who are the heroes and villains? How are you telling that story not just in words, but in your actions, your symbols, and the very spaces you inhabit? A story about maximizing shareholder value inspires no one. A story about striving, against all odds, to build something meaningful and lasting can move mountains. A medieval king didn't say, "My strategic objective is to consolidate my territorial holdings." He said, "God has given me this sacred duty to protect this realm," and then he commissioned a poem about it. What remains a mystery? We know the stories that survived, but how many competing narratives were lost? How many rebel songs and critical chronicles were systematically destroyed by those in power? How did the common person, the peasant in the field, truly perceive these official stories? Were they believers or were they cynical and detached, seeing the propaganda for what it was? And in our age of information saturation, is it even possible anymore to craft a single powerful narrative, or are we doomed to a permanent state of competing fragmented stories? Number 14, how do you act when you don't know anything? We are obsessed with data. We live in an age of analytics, big data, and real-time information. We believe that with enough data, we can eliminate uncertainty and make the perfect decision. A medieval leader faced the exact opposite problem. They operated in a fog of almost total uncertainty. Information was slow, unreliable, and often deliberately misleading. Leading in the Middle Ages was a masterclass in making high-stakes decisions with radically incomplete information. Imagine you are a king in London in the 13th century. You hear a rumor that a rival baron is gathering troops on the Welsh border. How do you get reliable information? You send a messenger on horseback. The journey could take days, even weeks, depending on the roads and the weather. The messenger could be intercepted, bribed, or killed. The information he brings back might be days out of date by the time he returns. The real-time data a medieval ruler had was often weeks old. By the time he learned of a problem, it might already be a catastrophe. This information scarcity had a profound impact on leadership. First, it placed an enormous value on intuition, or what we might call informed judgment. A leader had to be an excellent judge of character. They couldn't rely on a background check or performance metrics. They had to look a person in the eye and decide if they could be trusted. When a scout returned with a report, the leader had to assess not just the report, but the scout. Is he exaggerating? Is he hiding something? This ability to read people was a critical survival skill. Second, it forced a decentralized command structure. A king couldn't micromanage a campaign from hundreds of miles away. He had to grant his commanders on the ground, his castellans, and his dukes a great deal of autonomy. This is the origin of the feudal system in many ways. It was a network of delegated authority. A leader had to trust their subordinates to make the right decisions with the information they had locally. This concept is mirrored in modern military thinking, particularly the German concept of Auftragstaktik mission-type tactics, where commanders are given a clear objective but are free to decide how to achieve it. The idea is that the person on the ground knows the situation better than the general in headquarters. The medievals lived this by necessity. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is a classic example. Henry V of England was deep in enemy territory, his army sick and exhausted. He had very limited intelligence about the size and disposition of the French army. He couldn't email for satellite imagery or drone reconnaissance. He had to make a decision based on what his scouts could see and what he knew about the terrain. He chose his ground carefully, relied on his key technology, the longbow, and trusted his men. It was a huge gamble based on patchy information, and it paid off spectacularly. The lesson for us is not to abandon data, but to be humbled by its limitations. We can have all the data in the world and still make the wrong decision. Data can provide a false sense of certainty. It can lead to paralysis by analysis, where we wait for more and more information before acting, while the opportunity slips away. The medieval leader reminds us that at some point you have to make a call. You have to trust your judgment, and you have to trust your people. It's about developing the wisdom to know what is knowable and the courage to act in the face of the unknowable. As the political scientist Aaron Wildavsky wrote in his work on risk and safety, the key is not always prevention, which requires perfect foresight, but resilience, the ability to cope with surprises. So what are the lingering questions? How did medieval leaders develop this crucial intuition? Was it simply a lifetime of experience, or were there specific ways they trained their minds to see patterns and ambiguity? How did they handle the immense psychological stress of making life or death decisions in an information vacuum? And are we, in our data-rich world, letting our own cognitive muscles for judgment and intuition atrophy to a dangerous degree? Number 13, is your power real or just an idea? We think of a medieval king as an absolute monarch. His word is law. But this is mostly a fantasy. For most of the Middle Ages, a king's power was not absolute. It was negotiated, conditional, and constantly under threat. A king ruled not by force alone, but by consent of the governed. At least the powerful governed the great lords, dukes, and bishops. This is one of the most profound and forgotten lessons of the era. Power is a relationship, not a possession. The most famous example of this is Magna Carta. In 1215, a group of rebellious English barons forced King John to sign a document that limited his power. It established the principle that everyone, including the king, was subject to the law. And John was not a popular king. He had lost lands in France, raised taxes, and quarreled with the Pope. His barons didn't just grumble, they took up arms and forced him to the negotiating table at Runnymede. Magna Carta was essentially a failed peace treaty, but its core idea, that a ruler's power is not unlimited, echoed through the centuries and became a cornerstone of modern democracy. This wasn't a one-off event, it was the normal state of affairs. A king needed his nobles. He needed their soldiers for his armies, their advice for his council, and their cooperation to collect taxes and administer justice in the provinces. A king who alienated his great lords was a king on thin ice. The entire feudal structure was a pyramid of personal oaths. A king gave land to a duke in exchange for military service. That duke then gave portions of his land to lesser lords, and so on. This system of reciprocal obligation meant that power was always a two-way street. If a king violated his end of the bargain, his vassals could, and often did, claimed that he had broken the feudal contract, freeing them from their loyalty. This is a stark contrast to the modern, hierarchical corporate structure, where power flows from the top down. The CEO's authority is usually seen as absolute within the confines of the law. But the medieval model suggests that even this is an illusion. A modern leader is also reliant on the consent of their key barons, their senior executives, their most talented engineers, their top salespeople. If a leader loses the support of these key people, the organization will grind to a halt. They may not take up arms, but they will leave, taking their knowledge and talent with them. The scholar Joseph S. Nye Jr. developed the concepts of hard power coercion and soft power attraction and persuasion. A medieval king had to be a master of both. He had hard power in his royal army and his legal authority. But his soft power, his ability to persuade, inspire loyalty, and forge consensus among his powerful and often fractious nobles, was far more important for day-to-day governance. He spent much of his time traveling his kingdom, holding court, feasting with his lords, and constantly reinforcing personal relationships. It was a continuous campaign for buy-in. The lesson is that true authority isn't granted by an organizational chart. It's earned and constantly re-earned from the people you lead. Your title gives you formal authority, but your influence, your real power, comes from the trust and respect of your team. It comes from negotiation, compromise, and a clear understanding of what you need from your people and what they need from you. A leader who thinks their power is absolute is a leader who is one bad decision away from a rebellion, whether it's in a medieval court or a modern boardroom. But what don't we know? How did a successful king balance the need for consensus with the need for decisive action? Was there a tipping point where too much negotiation led to paralysis? We have the chronicles written from the king's perspective, but what did these power negotiations look like from the perspective of a minor baron? How do they organize and communicate to form a coalition against a king? And in our modern world, are the informal networks of influence within our organizations now more powerful than the formal hierarchies we draw on our charts? Number 12. What are your rituals communicating? We tend to be skeptical of ritual. We see it as empty ceremony, a waste of time that could be better spent on real work. We prefer efficiency and informality. The medieval world saw things very differently. This ritual and ceremony were not distractions from power. They were the very language of power. They were how order was created, how hierarchies were displayed, and how abstract ideas like loyalty and justice were made real and visible. Think of a coronation. This wasn't just a party for a new king. It was a deeply symbolic event. The anointing with holy oil connected the king to God, setting him apart from ordinary mortals. The crowning by a high-ranking cleric, like the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, signified the church's approval. The oaths sworn by the king to his people and by the nobles to the king publicly affirmed the reciprocal bonds of the feudal contract. As described in the book, The King's Two Bodies, by historian Ernst Kantorowicz, the coronation transformed the mortal man into a vessel for the immortal office of kingship. Every gesture, every object, every word was carefully chosen to communicate a message about power, legitimacy, and divine right. This use of ritual extended to all aspects of life. The ceremony of homage, where a vassal knelt before his lord, placed his hands between the lord's, and swore an oath of fealty, was a physical enactment of the social structure. It was a public performance that everyone witnessed and understood. A feast in the Great Hall was not just a meal. It was a carefully staged event where the seating arrangement reflected the social hierarchy. The quality of the food demonstrated the lord's wealth and generosity, and the giving of gifts reinforced bonds of loyalty. Even warfare was filled with ritual. The dubbing of a knight with the tap of a sword on the shoulder was a rite of passage that transformed a young man into a member of a warrior elite. The issuing of a formal challenge before a battle, the displaying of banners and heraldry, the rules governing the treatment of noble prisoners, these were all part of a code that gave structure and meaning to the brutal reality of conflict. In the corporate world, we have rituals too, but we often don't recognize them or use them intentionally. The weekly team meeting, the quarterly all-hands, the annual performance review, the holiday party, these are all rituals. But what are they actually communicating? Is the weekly meeting a vibrant exchange of ideas, or is it a tedious ritual that communicates that management doesn't trust the team to work independently? Does the all-hands event inspire a sense of shared purpose, or does it feel like a hollow piece of corporate theater? The medieval lesson is to take our rituals seriously. They are not empty formalities. They are powerful opportunities to communicate values, reinforce culture, and build community. A leader should think like a medieval master of ceremonies. How can we design our meetings to encourage collaboration? How can we celebrate success in a way that feels meaningful and not just performative? How can we onboard new team members with a rite of passage that makes them feel truly part of the group? As sociologists like Emil Durkheim argued, collective rituals create collective effervescence, a feeling of shared identity and emotional synchrony that binds a group together. Medieval leaders used this to build kingdoms. We can use it to build stronger, more cohesive teams. What are the big unanswered questions? How did people react when a ritual was performed badly or insincerely? Could a poorly executed coronation actually weaken a king's authority? We know the official meaning of these rituals, but what were the unofficial, backstage interpretations among different groups of people? And in our increasingly virtual and globalized world, how can we create meaningful rituals that work for people who may never meet in the same physical space? Number 11, are you building a company or a cathedral? We are driven by speed. We want quick returns, quarterly results, fast growth. Our planning horizon is often measured in months, not years. The medieval mindset offers a radical alternative. Some of the greatest achievements of the Middle Ages were projects of astonishingly long duration. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe were not built in a few years. Their construction often spanned centuries. And Chartres Cathedral in France is a prime example. The main structure we see today was mostly built between 1194 and 1220, a remarkable 26 years. But that was just one phase of a building that had been built, burned, and rebuilt for centuries. Other cathedrals took much longer. The construction of Cologne Cathedral began in 1248 and was not officially completed until 1880, more than 600 years later. Generations of builders, masons, and artisans devoted their entire lives to a project they knew they would never see finished. They were building for their great-grandchildren. What kind of leadership does it take to start something you won't complete? It requires a profound shift in perspective. It's a move away from personal ego and toward a transgenerational mission. The master mason who laid the foundation of a cathedral wasn't building for his own glory. He was building for the glory of God and the community. The king or bishop who funded the project was not just building a monument to his own reign, he was creating a legacy that would long outlive him, a physical embodiment of his kingdom's faith and power. This long-term thinking was also present in other areas. The founding of universities like Oxford and Bologna in the 11th and 12th centuries was an investment in knowledge that would pay dividends for centuries. The slow, patient work of clearing forests and draining marshes to create new farmland was a project that spanned generations. They were literally building their world, slowly and deliberately. This stands in stark contrast to the short-termism that plagues much of modern business and politics. A study by the consulting firm McKinsey found that firms with a long-term focus outperformed their peers on a range of economic measures. Yet the pressure for short-term results from shareholders and the market is relentless. A CEO who misses quarterly earnings targets is punished, even if they are making sound long-term investments in research and development or employee training. The medieval lesson is to ask ourselves what we are building. Are we building a temporary shelter for this quarter's results, or are we laying the foundation for a cathedral that will endure? This doesn't mean ignoring short-term needs. The builders of Chartres still had to manage their daily payroll and source their materials efficiently. But their daily work was guided by a larger, longer-term vision. For a modern leader, this means balancing the urgent with the important. It means investing in things that may not have an immediate payoff, like building a strong company culture, investing in fundamental research, or mentoring the next generation of leaders. It's about having the courage to plant a tree under whose shade you do not expect to sit. What are the unknowns here? How did they maintain the quality and the original vision of, a project like a cathedral over so many generations with changing leadership and evolving technologies? What were the funding models that allowed for such sustained century-spanning investment? We see the finished product, but the day-to-day project management of such an undertaking is still poorly understood. And is it even possible to recapture this long-term mindset in our current economic and cultural climate, which seems so fundamentally oriented towards speed and immediacy? Number 10, How is loyalty actually earned? We talk about loyalty as if it's a feeling. We want loyal employees and loyal customers. But in the medieval world, loyalty wasn't just a feeling, it was a tangible economic and social transaction. It was the fundamental currency of the entire political and military system, and it had to be constantly earned and renewed. It was never taken for granted. The feudal system was built on a web of personal oaths, but an oath was just the beginning. The real cement of the relationship was the fief, typically a grant of land. A lord gave his vassal land, and with it, the means to support himself and his family. In return, the vassal owed the lord service, usually military service. It was a clear, reciprocal arrangement, but it went deeper than that. A good lord was also expected to be generous. This concept was known as largesse. He was expected to give gifts, to feast his followers, to support them in their disputes, and to take care of their families if they died in his service. The Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf provides a powerful image of this. The king, Hrothgar, is described as a ring giver. His great hall, Heorot, is a place of feasting and gift-giving, where he rewards his loyal warriors Thenens with treasure. This generosity is not just a sign of wealth, it's a core leadership function. It's how he builds and maintains the loyalty of the men he needs to protect his kingdom. A lord who was stingy or who failed to reward his followers would quickly find himself abandoned. This personal, tangible nature of loyalty is something we've often lost. We try to buy loyalty with a salary, but that's just a transaction for labor. Medieval loyalty was about a much deeper, more personal bond. The lord and vassal had a relationship that extended beyond the workplace. They fought together, ate together, and their families were often interconnected. This personal connection is what turned a contractual obligation into a fierce personal allegiance. Leadership scholar Simon Sinek often talks about the circle of safety. He argues that a leader's job is to create an environment where people feel safe and supported so they can focus their energy on the real work. This is exactly what a good medieval lord did. By providing his vassals with land, protection, and justice, he created a circle of safety. In return, his vassals were willing to risk their lives for him. The lesson for modern leaders is that loyalty can't be demanded. It must be earned through a genuine commitment to the well-being of your people. It's not just about paying them fairly, it's about investing in their growth, supporting them when they struggle, recognizing their contributions in a meaningful way, and creating a culture where they feel seen and valued as human beings, not just as resources. It's the modern equivalent of largesse. Are you a ring giver? Are you known for your generosity with your time, your knowledge, and your support? Or are you a leader who takes more than you give? The answer to that question will determine the loyalty of your team. But what do we still not understand? Oaths were often broken. Loyalty was fluid. How did a leader know when loyalty was genuine versus when it was purely transactional and self-interested? What were the subtle, non-verbal cues they looked for? We read about acts of great loyalty and great betrayal, but what about the vast middle ground of lukewarm, conditional support? How was that managed day to day? And in our modern gig economy, is the very concept of long-term loyalty becoming an outdated fantasy? Number 9. Who whispers in your ear? No leader rules alone. Not a CEO, not a president, and certainly not a medieval king. The image of the solitary monarch making decisions by divine right is a myth. Every medieval ruler was surrounded by a council of advisors. The quality of their rule often depended on the quality of the people whispering in their ear. Choosing your counselors wisely and knowing how to listen to them was perhaps the most critical leadership skill of all. This group of advisors was known by different names in different places: the Curia Regis in England, the Conseil du Roi in France. It was typically composed of the great nobles of the realm, high-ranking churchmen like bishops and abbots, and key household officials. These were the people a king relied on for advice on law, finance, war, and diplomacy. They were his sounding board, his information network, and his administrative team. A wise king, like Charlemagne, who ruled the Franks from 768 to 814, actively sought out the best minds of his time. He gathered scholars, clerics, and warriors from all over Europe to his court at Aachen. His biographer Einhard describes how the emperor was not afraid to listen to advice and even change his mind. He understood that he was not the expert on everything, and that a diversity of perspectives led to better decisions. Conversely, a foolish king surrounded himself with flatterers and self-serving favorites. This was the downfall of many a monarch. King Edward II of England's reliance on his favorite, Piers Gaveston, and later the Despensers, alienated the established nobility and contributed directly to his overthrow. He listened to the people he liked, not the people he needed. He mistook friendship for wise counsel. This is a timeless leadership trap. The challenge for a medieval king was immense. His counselors were not disinterested consultants. Each of them had their own agenda, their own family interests, and their own ambitions. A duke from the north might give advice that benefited his own lands at the expense of the south. A bishop might give advice that strengthened the church's power at the expense of the crown. A king had to be a master psychologist, constantly filtering the advice he received, trying to discern the true motive behind the words. He had to know who to trust, who to be wary of, and how to balance the competing factions within his own council. This is directly applicable to modern leadership. A leader is only as good as the information and advice they receive. Do you surround yourself with people who will challenge you, who will bring you bad news, who will tell you the truth even when it's hard? Or do you surround yourself with wise men who only tell you what you want to hear? The psychologist Irving Janis developed the concept of groupthink, where a desire for harmony or conformity in a group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. A wise leader actively fights against groupthink. They seek out dissenting opinions. They create an environment where it is safe to disagree with the boss. The medieval lesson is a stark reminder to audit your inner circle. Who are your key advisors, both formal and informal? Do they represent a diversity of viewpoints and expertise? Are they willing to tell you that your brilliant idea is actually a terrible one? And you have the wisdom and humility to listen when they do. The whispers in a leader's ear can build a kingdom or burn it to the ground. What are the great unknowns about this? We know the names of the great counselors from the historical record, but what about the informal advisors, the spouses, the mistresses, the personal friends whose influence was immense but largely unrecorded? How did a king manage the intense personal rivalries and jealousies that must have defined life in a royal court? And in our modern world of endless communication, how does a leader filter out the noise and find the few crucial voices they truly need to hear? Number 8, are you leading a pyramid or a network? We are used to seeing organizations as pyramids. The CEO is at the top, followed by layers of management, all the way down to the frontline workers. It's a clear top-down structure of command and control. While medieval society was certainly hierarchical, the actual exercise of power was much more like a network than a pyramid. A king did not command his kingdom directly. He presided over a decentralized network of powerful semi-autonomous lords. This was the essence of feudalism. A king in Paris couldn't possibly manage the day-to-day affairs of a village in Gascony. He didn't have the bureaucracy, the communications technology, or the resources. So he delegated, he granted vast territories to his most powerful nobles, the dukes and counts. These nobles, in turn, granted smaller parcels of land to their own followers, the barons and knights. Each lord was the effective ruler of his own domain. He collected his own taxes, administered his own justice, and raised his own troops. The king at the top was more like a chairman of a very unruly board than an all-powerful CEO. This created a system of distributed leadership. The kingdom's strength depended not just on the king, but on the competence of hundreds of local leaders throughout the network. The king's primary job was to manage this network. He had to maintain his personal relationships with his key vassals, mediate their endless disputes, and try to align their self-interest with the interests of the realm as a whole. It was a constant, difficult balancing act. A strong king like Philip II of France reigned 1180 to 1223, was a master at this. He skillfully played his vassals off against each other, used marriage alliances to his advantage, and gradually consolidated royal power. A weak king saw the network fray, and the kingdom fall into civil war. This medieval model has fascinating parallels with modern organizational theory. For decades, companies have been moving away from rigid, hierarchical pyramids and toward more flexible network structures. The rise of project-based teams, remote work, and holacracy are all signs of this shift. In a complex, fast-changing world, a centralized, top-down command structure is often too slow and clumsy. Decisions need to be made at the edges of the organization, where the best information is. The lesson from the medieval world is about the art of leading a network. It's less about giving orders and more about cultivating relationships. It's less about direct control and more about influence and alignment. A leader in a networked organization needs to be a great communicator, a skilled negotiator, and a trusted broker. They need to ensure that the different nodes in the network, the teams, the departments, the individuals, are all working towards a common purpose, even as they enjoy a high degree of autonomy. As General Stanley McChrystal describes in his book Team of Teams, the modern leader's role is often to be more of a gardener than a chess master, creating the right environment and connections for success to grow, rather than directing every move. So, are you building a rigid pyramid that can be shattered by a single blow? Or are you cultivating a resilient network that can adapt and thrive in uncertainty? The medieval kings who lasted were the ones who understood the difference. What are the mysteries that remain? How did information and, more importantly, a sense of shared culture flow through these decentralized networks? We understand the formal oaths, but what were the informal mechanisms that held the system together? When a node in the network went rogue, what were the most effective strategies for bringing it back into alignment, short of all-out war? And as our own organizations become more networked and decentralized, are we prepared for the loss of control and the increase in political complexity that this medieval model shows is inevitable? Number 7, how do you lead when the world keeps ending? We think our times are uniquely challenging. We face economic uncertainty, political instability, and rapid technological change. But the medieval world experienced a level of sustained crisis that is almost unimaginable to us. They didn't have one crisis. They lived in a state of perpetual crisis. Famine, plague, and war were not exceptional events. They were the normal conditions of life. Leading in this environment required a type of resilience that we rarely cultivate today. Let's just consider the 14th century. It began with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a period of catastrophic crop failures and mass starvation across Europe. Then, in the middle of the century, came the Black Death. The plague, which arrived in 1347, killed an estimated 30% to 50% of Europe's population in just a few years. Imagine a world where 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know dies. Society was turned upside down. Labor became scarce, social structures crumbled, and a pervasive sense of doom settled over the continent. And all of this happened against the backdrop of constant brutal warfare, like the 100 Years' War between England and France, which dragged on for more than a century. How do you lead through that? How do you govern when the basic foundations of society are crumbling? Is medieval leaders couldn't just wait for things to get back to normal. This was the new normal. Survival required a combination of brutal pragmatism and deep faith. On the practical side, leaders had to be incredibly adaptable. After the Black Death, for example, the severe labor shortage gave peasants more bargaining power. Attempts by the ruling class to force them back into the old system, like the English Statute of Labours in 1351, were met with massive resistance, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The leaders who survived were the ones who could adapt to this new social and economic reality. On a deeper level, leadership required providing a sense of meaning and hope in a world that often seemed meaningless and hopeless. This is where the framework of the Christian faith was so critical. It provided a narrative that could explain suffering. Hardship was a test from God. The world might be a place of chaos and death, but there was the promise of salvation in the next life. A leader's piety, their public displays of faith, was not just personal. It was a way of reassuring their people that despite the chaos, there was still a divine order to the universe. This type of leadership is what scholar Ronald Heifetz calls adaptive leadership. It's not about providing easy answers or technical solutions. It's about helping people face a difficult new reality and make the painful adjustments required to thrive in it. It's about managing people's sense of loss and helping them find a new way forward. The leaders of the 14th century were forced to become masters of this. The lesson for us is to cultivate our own resilience and the resilience of our organizations. We will face crises. Our plans will be disrupted. Our world will change in ways we cannot predict. The medieval leader teaches us not to be surprised by this. They teach us to expect chaos and to build systems and cultures that can withstand it. It's about being resourceful, adaptable, and most importantly, providing a sense of purpose that transcends the crisis of the moment. It's about being the calm, steady hand in the middle of the storm, reminding everyone that this too shall pass and that there is still work to be done. What do we not know? On a personal level, What was the psychological toll of leading through such unrelenting trauma? Did these leaders suffer from a form of collective PTSD? We see their public actions, but we know little of their private despair. How do communities truly rebuild and innovate after a cataclysm like the Black Death? The historical records are often silent on the grassroots, bottom-up recovery efforts. And are we, in our relatively safe and stable modern world, losing the psychological toughness required to face a true existential crisis? Number 6, does your word mean anything? In a world without instant communication or legally binding digital contracts, a leader's most valuable asset was their reputation. Their fama, or public renown, was everything. It determined who would follow them, who would ally with them, and who would lend them money. A leader with a reputation for honesty, piety, and keeping their word was a leader who could command loyalty. A leader known for treachery and broken oaths was a leader who would soon find themselves isolated and powerless. And reputation, traveled by word of mouth, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and minstrels from one end of Europe to the other. It was a slow, analog, but incredibly powerful social network. A lord's actions in a remote corner of his lands could become a cautionary tale told in a royal court hundreds of miles away a few months later. This meant that every action was a public statement. How a lord treated his peasants, how he negotiated a treaty, how he conducted himself in battle, all of this fed into his public reputation. A good reputation was a strategic advantage. When a leader was known for keeping his promises, people were more willing to make agreements with him. This reduced the transaction costs of politics and diplomacy. You didn't need to spend as much time and resources creating complex enforcement mechanisms if you were dealing with someone whose word was their bond. The French king Louis IX was so renowned for his fairness and integrity that he was asked by other rulers, including King Henry III of England, to arbitrate their disputes. His reputation for justice was a source of international influence. Conversely, a bad reputation was a crippling liability. King John of England, he of Magna Carta fame, had a reputation for untrustworthiness. The chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall described him as a very bad man. He was known for breaking promises, seizing property unjustly, and mistreating his vassals. This reputation was a key reason his barons were eventually willing to take the radical step of rebelling against him. They simply could not trust him to rule justly. This focus on personal honor and reputation seems archaic to us. Our legal system is designed to enforce contracts regardless of the personal character of the people involved. But the medieval lesson remains profoundly relevant. In any organization, there is the formal structure, and then there is the informal economy of trust. A leader who is known for being reliable, for meaning what they say and saying what they mean, will find that everything is easier. People will give them the benefit of the doubt. They will be more willing to go the extra mile. Information will flow more freely. A leader with a reputation for dishonesty or inconsistency creates a culture of fear and cynicism. People will spend their time documenting everything in emails to cover themselves. They will be reluctant to take risks. They will constantly be trying to decipher the real meaning behind the leader's words. This creates a huge amount of friction and wasted energy. As Stephen M.R. Covey argues in his book, The Speed of Trust, when trust is high, speed goes up and costs go down. The medievals understood this as a matter of political survival. So, what is your reputation? When you are not in the room, what do people say about you? Do they say that your word is good? That you are fair? That you can be trusted? In the long run, this intangible asset is more valuable than any line item on a balance sheet. What are the great unknowns here? How did a leader go about deliberately repairing a damaged reputation? We have stories of public penance and grand gestures, but what did the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust actually look like? How were conflicting reputations adjudicated? When one chronicle called a king a saint and another called him a tyrant, how did people decide which story to believe? And in our modern world of online reputation and instant judgment, is it still possible to build the kind of slow, deep, and resilient reputation that medieval leaders relied upon? Number 5, are you seen as fair? One of the most fundamental duties of a medieval monarch was to dispense justice. The king was the highest court in the land, the ultimate guarantor of law and order. But justice was more than just a legal process. It was a performance. It was a public spectacle designed to demonstrate the king's power, his wisdom, and his commitment to the well-being of his people. Being seen as a just ruler was a cornerstone of legitimacy. The tradition of the king as judge is an ancient one. We see it in the biblical story of King Solomon. In the Middle Ages, this was a very real and personal duty. People believed they had a right to appeal directly to their king. As we saw with Louis IX of France holding court under an oak tree, a good king made himself accessible. He would travel his kingdom on a judicial air, a circuit tour where he and his judges would hear cases in local communities. This was a brilliant political move. It brought the power of the central government to the far corners of the realm. It allowed the king to be seen by his subjects, and it reinforced the idea that justice flowed from the crown. The proceedings were often public. This was crucial. Justice had to be seen to be done. When a lord settled a dispute between two peasants in his manorial court, the whole village was often there to witness it. This public nature ensured a degree of transparency and reinforced social norms. The verdict wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a reaffirmation of the community's values. This idea of justice as a performance is something we have lost in our modern bureaucratic legal systems. But the underlying principle is more important than ever. In any organization, a leader is also a judge. You have to resolve disputes between team members. You have to make decisions about promotions and resource allocation. You have to enforce the rules, and your people are watching you constantly, judging whether you are being fair. This sense of procedural justice, as organizational psychologists call it, is incredibly important. Research has consistently shown that employees' perception of the fairness of procedures is often more important than the actual outcomes. Is an employee who doesn't get a promotion but feels the process was fair and transparent is likely to remain engaged. An employee who feels the process was biased or arbitrary will become resentful and disengaged, even if they like the final outcome. The medieval lesson is that a leader must not only be fair, but must also be seen to be fair. This means making your decision-making processes as transparent as possible. When you have to make a tough call, explain the criteria you used. Allow people to voice their opinions. Listen to all sides of a story before making a judgment. Like a medieval king holding public court, you need to show your work. This builds trust and reinforces the idea that you are a just and impartial leader, not someone who plays favorites or makes arbitrary decisions. It transforms your authority from something that is merely imposed to something that is seen as legitimate. What are the big unanswered questions? How much of royal justice was genuine and how much was pure political theater? We know that justice was rarely blind. A noble's word often counted for more than a peasant's. How is this fundamental inequality managed and justified in a system that publicly proclaimed its fairness? How do people use and manipulate the justice system for their own ends? And in our own organizations, what are the unconscious biases that are subtly undermining our attempts to be seen as fair leaders? Number 4, whose good are you really serving? The modern corporate leader is supposed to serve the shareholders. The modern politician is supposed to serve their constituents. The lines of responsibility seem clear. In the medieval world, it was much messier. A leader was caught in a web of competing obligations. They had a duty to God, a duty to the church, a duty to their vassals, a duty to their family and their dynasty, and a vague, emerging duty to the realm or the common good. Balancing these competing interests was the central challenge of medieval statecraft. A king's coronation oath often included a promise to protect the church, uphold the laws, and defend the people. This was the ideal of the Christian prince. But in practice, a king was also a feudal lord. He had made specific promises to his great nobles in exchange for their loyalty. Often, what was good for the realm, like a new tax to fund a war, was directly opposed by the interests of his nobles who didn't want to pay the tax. Then there was the constant tension between the secular and the religious. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries was a massive Europe-wide power struggle between popes and emperors over who had the right to appoint bishops. Was a bishop a servant of the church or a major landowner and vassal of the king? The answer was both, and this created endless conflict. A leader had to navigate the demands of their faith and the demands of political reality. Finally, there was the powerful pull of dynasty. A king's primary duty was often seen as ensuring the survival and prosperity of his own family line. This could lead him to make decisions like marrying for a political alliance rather than for the good of the kingdom that had long-term negative consequences. He was not just a CEO, he was the head of a family business where the stakes were entire kingdoms. This constant balancing act is a powerful lesson for modern leaders. We also face a multitude of stakeholders with competing interests: employees, customers, shareholders, regulators, and the wider community. It is easy to say the customer is always right, or our only duty is to shareholder value, but the reality is always a series of complex trade-offs. What's good for shareholders, like cutting labor costs, might be bad for employees. What's good for customers, like lower prices, might be bad for profit margins. The medieval leader reminds us that leadership is not about finding a perfect solution that pleases everyone. That is impossible. It is about wisely and ethically managing these competing interests. It's about being clear about your priorities. It's about understanding that every decision will benefit some and disadvantage others. A good leader doesn't pretend these tensions don't exist. They acknowledge them, they communicate their decisions clearly, and they try to find a path forward that serves a greater good without completely alienating any key constituency. This is the messy human work of leadership. It's not a science, it's an art. It's the art of holding multiple competing truths in your head at the same time and still being able to act decisively. The medieval king who claimed to be serving only God, or only his nobles, or only the people was usually lying. The successful ones were those who admitted, at least to themselves, that they were trying to serve them all at once, and that it was a constant, impossible, but necessary struggle. What do we still not know? When a king made a decision, how did he privately weigh these competing loyalties? We see the public justification, but what was the internal calculus? How did the concept of the common good or the good of the realm evolve from a vague idea into a powerful political force? We see the conflicts, but what were the day-to-day moments of successful compromise and integration that made the system function at all? And are modern leaders truly any better at managing these conflicts, or do we just use more sophisticated language to hide the same messy reality of competing interests? Number 3, when was the last time you ate with your team? In our world of remote work, email, and Slack, it's possible to lead a large team without ever sharing a meal with them. Communication has become efficient, but has also become disembodied and impersonal. For a medieval leader, this would have been unthinkable. Leadership was a face-to-face, personal, and highly social activity. And one of the most important arenas for this was the dinner table. The Great Hall was the heart of any medieval castle or manor. It was the command center, the courtroom, and the social hub. And every day, the Lord would eat there with his household, his knights, and his key retainers. The feast was not just about food. It was a daily ritual that reinforced the bonds of the community. It was where a lord could talk with his men in a less formal setting, hear their concerns, and judge their mood. It was where stories were told, songs were sung, and a shared identity was forged. This practice of commensality, or eating together, has deep roots in human society. Anthropologists have long recognized that sharing food is a fundamental way of creating and affirming social bonds. In the medieval context, it was a crucial leadership tool. A lord who ate in private, separated from his followers, was seen as aloof, arrogant, and untrustworthy. The lord who shared his food and drink was seen as generous and open, one of them. The physical act of eating together built a personal connection that went beyond a mere contractual obligation. When you have shared bread and salt with someone, you have a different kind of relationship with them. This was the foundation of the Comitatus, the band of loyal warriors who followed a chieftain, a concept that dates back to Germanic tribes and was a forerunner of the feudal vassalage. They were a band of brothers, united by shared meals and shared danger. This principle is still incredibly powerful today. A manager who always eats lunch at their desk or only with other managers is creating an invisible wall between themselves and their team. A leader who makes a point of regularly eating in the company cafeteria or taking the team out for a meal is breaking down that wall. It's in these informal moments that real conversations happen. It's where you learn about people's families, their hobbies, their worries. It's where you build the kind of human connection that makes people want to work for you. Studies in organizational behavior support this. A 2015 Cornell University study found that fire stations where the firefighters ate together had better team performance compared to stations where they ate alone. The researchers concluded that the simple act of eating together helped to foster a sense of community and cooperation. The medieval lesson is simple but profound. Leadership is personal. You cannot lead effectively through email alone. You have to connect with people on a human level. Sharing a meal is one of the oldest and most powerful ways to do that. It's a small investment of time that can pay huge dividends in trust, morale, and teamwork. It forces you to put down your phone, look people in the eye, and have a real conversation. In our hyper-efficient world, this simple ancient ritual might be one of the most effective leadership techniques we have. What are the big unknowns? We know about the great feasts, but what was the daily reality of these meals? Were they tense, political affairs, or genuinely collegial? How did the Lord manage the status differences and potential conflicts that could arise in such a setting? We see the ideal, but the messy human reality is harder to reconstruct. And in our modern diverse workplaces, how can we adapt this ancient practice of commensality in a way that is inclusive and comfortable for everyone? Number two, how do you lead when the rules keep changing? We often see the Middle Ages as a static, unchanging period, but that thousand-year span was a time of immense and often disruptive change. The rules of the game were constantly being rewritten by new technologies, new social forces, and new ideas. A leader who failed to adapt was a leader who would be left behind. Think about the evolution of warfare. At the beginning of the period, the dominant force on the battlefield was the heavily armored noble knight on horseback. The entire feudal system was designed to support this one type of warrior, but then new technologies emerged that challenged this dominance. In the 14th century, the English longbow proved that a well-trained peasant archer could defeat a French knight from a distance. The battles of Crécy 1346 and Agincourt 1415 were shocking demonstrations of this new reality. Later, the development of effective gunpowder weapons, like cannons and handguns, made stone castles and armored knights almost obsolete. A leader who clung to the old way of fighting was doomed. The economy was also in constant flux. The early medieval period was overwhelmingly agrarian and local, but by the High Middle Ages, trade was reviving, towns and cities were growing, and a new merchant class was emerging. This new class, with its wealth based on cash and commerce, didn't fit neatly into the old feudal structure of land-based power. A wise king, like many in the late Middle Ages, learned to ally with this new class, granting charters to towns in exchange for taxes. They adapted to the new economic reality. A lord who ignored the rise of the towns and tried to rule as if nothing had changed found his power base eroding. Even ideas were changing. The rise of universities created a new class of educated administrators and lawyers. The rediscovery of Roman law provided new models for governance. Religious movements like the Franciscan and Dominican orders challenged old assumptions. The world was not standing still. This is the medieval lesson that perhaps resonates most strongly with our own time. We too live in an age of rapid disruptive change. A business model that works today might be obsolete tomorrow. A technology that is cutting edge this year will be standard in the next. A leader who is not constantly learning, adapting, and questioning their own assumptions is a leader who is presiding over a declining enterprise. The key skill is not just about adopting new technologies. It's about having the mental flexibility to change your entire way of thinking. For a 15th century nobleman, accepting that a peasant with a gun could kill him was not just a tactical shift, it was a psychological and social earthquake. It upended a worldview that had been in place for centuries. Similarly, for a modern leader, embracing a change like the shift to remote work or the rise of AI is not just about buying new software. It's about fundamentally rethinking how work gets done, how teams are managed, and what the purpose of an office even is. The medieval world teaches us that stability is an illusion. The leaders who survived and thrived were the ones who saw the changes coming, who were willing to abandon old traditions that no longer served them, and who had the courage to experiment with new ways of doing things. They were the ultimate adaptive leaders. What are the great unknowns here? How did individual leaders manage the immense psychological stress of having their entire worldview upended by change? We see the successful adaptations, but how many leaders failed because they simply could not or would not see the new reality? What were the communication strategies used to persuade an entire organization like a feudal army to adopt a radical new way of doing things? And are we, despite all our talk of innovation, actually any better at letting go of our own outdated assumptions than a 14th century knight was? Number one, what do you owe to a power greater than yourself? In our secular age, leadership is often about the self. It's about self-actualization, personal branding, and individual achievement. A leader's ultimate responsibility is often to themselves or to a purely human construct like the shareholders or the state. The medieval leader operated within a profoundly different framework. Their authority, their life, and their entire world were understood to be subordinate to a higher power God. This was not just a matter of personal belief, it was the fundamental organizing principle of society. A king did not rule by his own might alone, he ruled by the grace of God. This belief had a powerful double effect. On the one hand, it gave the leader an incredible sense of legitimacy and purpose. They were not just a manager or a warlord, they were God's chosen instrument on earth. This could inspire them to great acts of courage and sacrifice. On the other hand, it placed a heavy burden of responsibility on them. If they ruled by God's grace, they were also accountable to God. They would be judged not just on their victories and their wealth, but on their moral character and their adherence to divine law. This idea of a final, divine judgment was a powerful check on the abuse of power. A king might be able to escape the judgment of his subjects, but he could not escape the judgment of God. This belief fostered a sense of humility and a recognition that their power was not truly their own. It was a trust granted from on high. We see this in the practice of rulers performing public acts of penance. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, after being excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII in 1076, famously stood for 3 days in the snow at Canossa, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. This was a stunning act of humility for the most powerful secular ruler in Europe. It was a public acknowledgement that even he was subject to a higher moral authority. This connection to a higher purpose is something that is often missing from modern leadership. When the ultimate goal is simply to increase profit by 10% this year, it can be difficult to inspire deep commitment or to make difficult ethical choices. The pursuit of a purpose greater than oneself is a powerful motivator. It can provide a North Star that guides decisions, especially in difficult times. It can give meaning to the daily struggles and sacrifices that leadership requires. This doesn't have to be a religious purpose. It can be a commitment to a scientific breakthrough that will help humanity, a dedication to creating a product that genuinely improves people's lives, or a mission to build a just and equitable society. The specific purpose is less important than the fact that it is something transcendent, something bigger than the leader's own ego or bank account. As Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Medieval leaders had a powerful why. The final and perhaps most profound lesson from this forgotten world is to ask ourselves, what is our why? To what higher purpose are we dedicating our leadership? Are we serving only ourselves, or are we serving something greater? The medieval king, kneeling for his coronation, understood that true authority comes not from elevating oneself, but from submitting to a purpose beyond oneself. That might be the most timeless leadership lesson of all. What do we not know? How much of this public piety was genuine faith, and how much was cynical political calculation? For a ruler like Henry IV, was his penance at Canossa a moment of true spiritual crisis or a brilliant strategic move? How did leaders reconcile their personal faith with the often brutal and immoral acts that were required to hold on to power? The gap between the ideal of the Christian prince and the bloody reality of medieval politics is vast and full of unanswered questions. And in our modern secular world, where can we find the shared transcendent purposes that can bind us together and give our own leadership a deeper, more resilient meaning?